So I think we've got a good number of people through the door quite promptly. So I think I'll kick off because we have quite a lot to get through this morning. And it would be nice to stick to time. So let me start off by introducing myself. I'm Dr. Eliza Cosman. I'm Deputy Director of Research at TASO, and I'm here today to present our online teaching and learning report launch. So really excited that you can join us this morning. Before we start into the substance of the webinar, I have a few housekeeping points to go through. So first of all, just to repeat for those of you who have joined a little bit later, you are automatically muted and your videos are turned off. That's the webinar format we're using in Zoom. So please don't worry if you feel like you're a bit blind and we can't see you. That's just how it works. During the panel session later, please could you enter any questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. That will allow us to triage them and ask them at the panel. So that's where you should put your questions as they emerge. We are recording this session, so we'll be distributing that later via our channels. Please look out for that. And we will be asking for your feedback as well. So please look out for a follow-up email after the event. And please do share your feedback. We really use it to try and improve what we're doing and make sure it's useful for everyone who's interested in TASO's events. We have enabled closed captioning on this event, so if you need that, please select the captions button from the bottom of the screen, and that should allow you to have that pop up. So those are all of my housekeeping points, and with no further ado, I'll move us into the body of this webinar. And as I mentioned, this is a new piece of work on online teaching and learning from TASO. We wanted to do this piece of work because the COVID-19 pandemic and general trends in higher education mean there's more online teaching and learning than ever before. And we wanted to take a look at what the impact of that move might be on outcomes like attainment and progression on course, and whether there was any impact on attainment and progression and other outcomes for certain disadvantaged and underrepresented groups in particular, because that's TASO's particular focus. As you'll see from our presentation today, much of the evidence that we're able to draw on and the evidence that we've produced is very much related to the context of the pandemic, and that's just the nature of the evidence that's available to us at the moment. But the question that's open for the sector is really what we do next and how we keep an eye on this issue as online teaching and learning becomes more prevalent in the sector. What is the impact and the differential impact on different groups? And that's the conversation we want to contribute to today. So this is really a foundational piece. It's about producing a blueprint and a jumping off point for more work on this, which we hope TASO can support. In terms of formats, we're going to start with a presentation from my colleague, Dr. Rob Summers, who will take you through the findings from this specific piece of work, which we have produced. And then we'll move into a panel discussion with some panelists who have joined us today. So Professor Liz Moores from Aston University, Nasser Latif from UCLan, and Anna Lazic from the University of Bath, who's a student there. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So please do make sure you're storing up your questions to ask those panelists. So we're going to run from 10:30 till 12 o'clock, and we'll kick off now by moving into our presentation from Rob. So over to you, Rob. Please start presenting your slides.
Thank you, Eliza, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk, as Eliza said, about the data analysis we've done to look at online teaching and learning and lessons from the pandemic to shape future practice. I'd like to acknowledge all the people who've contributed to this report in some way. So my co-authors, Eliza Cosman and Rain Sherlock, and the contributing authors who are Paul Adams and Zara Boudelery-Baresi. So although I'm sure I don't need to remind you about what happened when COVID-19 hit, particularly hit the UK in early 2020, but how it affected universities in the middle of March, most of the sort of midway through their second semester of teaching in most cases. It meant that the campus was off limits, teaching and assessment essentially moved online, and students became reliant on home internet and study spaces. And this persisted into the year after, where all teaching and assessment was moved online, except for certain science courses where there were strict requirements on people to do lab work, and the sort of the full impact of the pandemic on learning in higher education hit. So our response to that was to look at a rapid evidence review for what happens to students when teaching is moved online. And we're looking at both pre-pandemic literature, which of course was the majority of the literature, but also literature generated during the pandemic. And in addition to that, we've got a call, we put out a call for institutional data. So we could perhaps look at attainment and progression from all higher education institutions for data from pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, and also from when it just hit. So the results of our rapid evidence review found that there was a mixed evidence of effectiveness for the move to online teaching, but this is when online teaching is planned in advance, so courses are specifically designed for it. There are a small number of studies that suggest that online learning maintains or improves student outcome, but overall that it is associated with worse outcomes, but course design seems to be key. But the move to online learning due to COVID didn't allow much time for planning, and many courses may simply have been moved from face-to-face teaching to online rather than the planning of an online course. And the evidence suggests this results in worse outcomes for students, particularly those from perhaps disadvantaged backgrounds who may not have had access to the tech that required to access the courses, both the devices and the internet connection, and also their study spaces as well may not have been ideal. So we put out a call for institutional data, and there was some interest in providing it, but in the end, we only received a submission from one higher education provider. This higher education provider provided us with data from just over 1,000 undergraduates from 3 levels of study across 3 academic years. There were home and international students, and there were 2 courses and 58 modules. These 1,000 students roughly equate to between 150 and 200 for each year level of study and each academic year. In addition to the data that we provided with was sex, ethnicity, which was quite fine-grained, but for this provider, there weren't very many non-white students, so we've ended up categorizing the data into 2 categories of white and black and minority ethnic students. We have data for disability, but again, only whether the student identified as disabled or not. We have data for mature students, so that's students who are 21 years or over. We have measures of disadvantage, either Polar 4 or index of multiple deprivation. We also were given the home address, the resident postcodes of not the resident postcodes, but the resident type of accommodation that students were living in each year of study. So that could be either halls, rented accommodation or home. We had their prior entry qualifications, which were A-levels, BTECs, access courses or other, and whether or not they were eligible for the provider's bursary. The outcome measures that we are looking at are the attainment, which is their percentage in each module, which is made up of coursework and exams, and also whether they continued to the next level of study, so first to second year, second to third year, or progressed out of university, so they actually graduated from their final year. Now, we obtained quite fine description of the teaching and assessment data from the higher education institution in terms of the number of hours, different modes of teaching, so whether it was lectures, seminars, online, and also the assessment data as to how much coursework, exams and so on. But unfortunately, due to the sample size of our sample, there just isn't, that's too fine-grained an analysis for the number of students we've got. So we decided to just categorize the teaching and assessment into 3 levels. So we had data from 2018-19 before we'd even heard of COVID-19. We classified that as normal teaching and assessment. And then in 2019-20, where the vast majority of the teaching was conducted normally, but only the latter part of teaching and assessment was disrupted by the pandemic. We've called that the disrupted level of teaching. And finally, 2021, the 2020-2021 academic year, when all teaching and assessment moved online. Now we come to our measures of disadvantage, and we've got 3 possible ones that we could choose between: either Polar 4, IMD, or Index of Multiple Deprivation, or bursary eligibility. Now for Polar 4, we had data for 93% of the students, and it's quite likely that the vast majority of the missing data there is from international students, as Polar 4 is a UK-wide measure. For those who don't know, it's the proportion of young people who participate in higher education in a given area of the UK. And so most postcodes have a Polar 4 quintile, and quintiles 1 and 2 are generally considered disadvantaged. But it is a weaker measure of disadvantage. A better area-based measure of disadvantage is the Index of Multiple Deprivation. However, in this case, we only had about 75% of the data. The chances are that this is because this provider takes in students from multiple countries of the UK. The Index of Multiple Deprivation is, while it is a UK-wide measure, each constituent country of the UK has a different version of IMD, and they're not directly comparable. So that, unfortunately, is a problem. So we might prefer to use IMD over Polar 4 in normal circumstances, but with so much missing data, this may be a problem. Now, bursary eligibility looks much better. We have 100% coverage here, but we know that provision of bursary can affect behaviour. There's research by one of our panellists, Liz Moores, who has shown that retention in particular is affected by the provision of means-tested bursaries. So if we're looking for an effect of disadvantage, but we try to counteract that effect of disadvantage, then bursary eligibility may not be the right way of looking at it. So despite our misgivings about using Polar 4 as a much weaker measure of disadvantage, that is the one we're going to use today. In the report, we do look at IMD, but with so much missing data, it's much more difficult to draw any conclusions from it. So we have complete data from 938 students, and our definition of disadvantage, which follows that for the Office for Students, is that quintiles 1 and 2 are considered disadvantaged. And that about 38% of our students in this sample fall into that category. We do some robustness checks. So by either assigning the missing data to the disadvantaged category or the non-disadvantaged category, and that makes no difference to the findings here. It might narrow the gap in some cases or widen the gap in others, but fundamentally the overall picture is the same, whether or not we put the data from those missing students into the non-disadvantaged or disadvantaged category. And a reminder there that missing data is likely international students, and the likelihood is they would generally not be considered not disadvantaged. So our research question is there any evidence that students from disadvantaged backgrounds are differentially affected by the move to online teaching and assessment? And that's for attainment, which we'll assess using a linear mixed effects model, and continuation and progression, where we'll use a logistic regression for each level of study. So that's for first years, second years, and final year students separately. So just to sort of try and get across the kind of patterns in the data that we might be looking at. So in all of these graphs here, we've got panels where attainment on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and time here we'll be thinking about in terms of how the teaching changed. So at the left-hand end, teaching was normal. At the right-hand end, teaching had moved online. And we've got it for two groups of people, those from not disadvantaged backgrounds and these from disadvantaged backgrounds. So again, this is just illustrative examples of what we might find. So for data where there's no interaction, we show that we find a sort of a gap sort of pre-pandemic, and then moving to post-pandemic, that gap stays the same. There might be a rise in this case in the attainment, but the gap has stayed the same, and so there's no interaction, and that's the same for either of these plots, where the gap between the two groups that we're looking at has stayed the same. However, for an interaction, we might see we'll see quite a different pattern. For example, in this right-hand panel at the beginning, we've got these two gaps, but at the end, for example, in this panel, the left-hand the gap has grown quite markedly. In this case, it's because I've illustrated it through students from not disadvantaged backgrounds showing an increase in attainment, whereas the interaction on this panel is, although the gap is the same, the sign has swapped around. So students in this illustration from not disadvantaged backgrounds have dropped their attainment, whereas those from disadvantaged backgrounds have increased their attainment. So this is sort of showing the kind of interaction patterns we might be looking for in the data. So this is the result. I'm going to talk you through the results of our modelling. And so these are the linear mixed effects models on attainment, and we're comparing our, we're looking at the interaction between our measure of disadvantage and teaching mode, and we've also added in all the covariates to account for sex, ethnicity, prior entry qualifications, etc. So our estimated module mark from the model is on the y-axis, and our different modes of teaching on the x-axis. So we've got normal teaching when the pandemic hit, so the disrupted teaching, and what we've called online teaching when everything pretty much moved online. And different symbols will be for the not disadvantaged students versus those from disadvantaged backgrounds. So during normal teaching and assessment, students from disadvantaged backgrounds, the estimated module mark from our model was roughly around 46%. When teaching moved, when the pandemic initially hit and teaching and assessment were disrupted, the attainment barely changed. However, for this group of students, when teaching moved online, the attainment dropped by around 5 percentage points. And you can see that although there's a similar pattern of data for the students from who were from not disadvantaged backgrounds, you can see there is a small gap between between the two groups, and this widens considerably in online teaching. In fact, the gap is 4.8 percentage points for online teaching, and it's only 2 percentage points pre-pandemic. And this is the 5% level, a significant change in the attainment gap. It might not seem like much, but this widening of the attainment gap here compared with pre-pandemic changes the final end of year classification, so first to 2-1, 2-1 to 2-2, for about 15 to 20% of the students. So it has quite a large effect, even though the overall attainment differences are quite small. Now, if we move on to continuation and progression, which I've split into each level of study, so first year, second and third year. So if we just look at the left-hand panel to start with, again, the x-axis is the normal, disrupted or online teaching. The y-axis now is the percentage of students who progressed onto the next level of study. So for first years, it's always the percentage of students who progressed to the second year, for second years who progressed to the third year, and for third years who progressed who graduated. So again, the estimated rate of progression, of continuation progression for first years during pre-pandemic times is around sort of 55 to 60%, but you can see the quite large confidence intervals here. The amount of data we've got means that we're much less able to estimate the rates of progression based on all the covariates that we're using. When teaching was disrupted by the pandemic, we see an increase in the progression rate. This may well be due to things like the non-detriment policies implemented by many universities to prevent students from being unfairly discriminated against by illness and the pandemic more generally. However, when teaching and assessment moved back online, the progression rate dropped quite markedly again. And while this was the case for disadvantaged students in the second year, and pretty much the same pattern in the third year, although for third year students who from disadvantaged backgrounds during normal teaching, they had a relatively high progression rate. But as you can see, that overall for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, the progression rate dropped during online teaching. When we add in those students from non-disadvantaged backgrounds, we find broadly a very similar pattern, with a possible exception in the third year when online teaching occurred, but these differences are just not significant. Basically, the sample size is too small for us to be able to reliably estimate whether or not these differences are meaningful or not. So as I said, there are a few limitations to this analysis. One is the sample size. We've only got around 150 to 200 students per year. We can't disentangle the effects of a module being taught online from the effect of it being taught in the context of the pandemic, unfortunately. With finer grained data, we might be able to do so, and certainly with more data. Another limitation is this is purely based on demographic data. So we've got no behavioural data in here from, say, a learner analytics system. So we don't know if students changed their behaviour at all in how they interacted with online courses versus face-to-face teaching. Were they more likely to attend or less likely to attend online lectures, for example? And we know from pre-pandemic work with face-to-face teaching that actually it's the behavioural data accounts for much more of the variation in attainment than does demographic data. And the other thing we don't have is any data from after the 2020-2021 academic year, when university campuses reopened and teaching sort of got back to normal, but in a different way. We know that universities have carried out blended teaching and learning. And so that would also be a useful marker to have to see how what the long-term effects are, or longer-term effects are of the changes in teaching practice that universities have undertaken. So in summary, we've got tentative evidence for a widening gap between students from disadvantaged backgrounds and their non-disadvantaged peers associated with the move to online teaching and assessment. But there's no conclusive evidence for a similar gap for continuation and progression. So our recommendations coming from the evidence review, the design of online courses is important, and we recommend that, and the evidence suggests that coordinated student-to-student interaction is really important. Feedback between teaching staff and students is really important, and that universities need to consider appropriate frequency and timing of their online teaching and assessment to avoid student fatigue. Higher education providers should make use of their institutional data and differing pedagogical approaches to design and conduct evaluations that will allow us to draw strong conclusions about what works in a UK context in terms of online teaching. And also future research should definitely focus on the student experiences, and we'll hear from a student who experienced the pandemic firsthand. Because students from disadvantaged backgrounds may be more likely to be adversely affected by the shift to online learning, teaching and assessment. So we should absolutely be making sure that we know we hear from the students. And the recommendations from the analysis, we need to use better measures of disadvantage, and this has been recognised in some recent reports. Free school meal eligibility is one of the better ones, and that would be much more helpful in determining how disadvantage interacts with other factors in teaching and learning. We need to incorporate behavioural data, so attendance at lectures, use of the virtual learning environments, use of the library. And we'd also use data from multiple institutions. And this will allow us, hopefully, to disentangle the effect of how the teaching was conducted from the progress of the pandemic, because with data from multiple institutions, we might have a more fine-grained analysis of the actual teaching that occurred on a per module basis. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rob, for stepping us through the findings of that review and the data analysis. We are going to move on to our panel discussion in just a second, but I do have one question through the Q&A from Sally Andrews, who says, do you have any sense of why there was only one provider who responded to the call? Which, Rob, I'll respond to if that's okay, because I was there during that piece of work. And Sally, one of the reasons was that we first started trying to get this data during the pandemic. And obviously that was an incredibly busy time for providers trying to move their provision online and respond to all sorts of challenges. So I think that was not although that was a kind of the right time to start asking these questions, it wasn't the right time to start collecting and analysing the data, which was one of those frustrations, I think. So we were incredibly grateful for the providers who did work with us, and a couple of other providers did also help in preliminary discussions, but we carried forward one provider for the eventual analysis. I think what we'd look to do now is, as we move into the next phase of bringing in more online provision, look at where those opportunities are to build more evaluation of that provision. So definitely a limitation of what we've been able to present so far, but something we're hoping to build on in future. I'm going to move us on to the panel discussion. So we're really pleased and delighted to have with us today Professor Liz Moores, who's Deputy Dean in the College of Health and Life Sciences and Aston University, and has done lots of really interesting work on institutional data in this kind of space. Nasser Latif, who's Head of Student Retention and Achievement at the University of Central Lancashire, and Anna Lazic, who's a student at the University of Bath and is here to bring the student perspective. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today. And I'm going to kick off with Liz and then Nasser, and just ask for your reflections on how you see the findings of this report shaping the future of online teaching in higher education.
Yes, I think it's a really important report from my point of view, and hopefully will be the start of a conversation. I think it emphasises the importance of us evaluating these kinds of data, particularly when we change methods of teaching. It's not to say the way we were teaching before was perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think when we do make changes and when we consider what the new normal might be, it's really important to evaluate group differences and the impact on various groups.
Thank you. Nasser, do you have reflections on how this work might help shape the future of online teaching and learning?
Like Liz, I agree, it's an opener for the conversation around sort of how we've been operating for a significant period now, and how perhaps impactful that's been, and perhaps how it's impacted different groups. I found some of the analysis really interesting. I know we're going to go into it in terms of the impact on different groups, but for me, it's again reaffirming the importance of that student connectedness piece. So I know in the report it references student interactions and how that is embedded in course design. So for me, that really jumped out, and intuitively it agreed with me in what I've observed over the last couple of years in two quite different institutions.
Do you have any examples of case studies of good practice you've identified on that front, or evaluation of that sort of activity, or do you feel like it's more nascent at the moment, that it's more anecdotal, the piece around student connections, and we need a firmer evidence base to really propel that forward?
I think that the evidence around it being an issue is there. So I mean, this is an example, but also I think one key have done a piece with Pearson around belonging, and it echoes sort of feedback, I think, from students when they've unified in terms of their response to the pandemic through the NSS or whatever else that might be. In terms of how we go about resolving it, I think students gave us quite a lot of grace at the start of the pandemic, because we talked about the big pivot. And as we're now sort of 3 years past that point, I think we saw quite a significant evolution in the following academic year, where there was significant jump in provision. But I don't think that progress, specifically around the student connection piece, has evolved significantly in an online setting. And it might be that we need to consider the purpose of online teaching in a blended context, and actually recognize it can't serve the social connected piece as well as we'd want. So how do we then evolve our on-campus provision to compensate almost for that? I've got a couple of examples I can share perhaps later on, in terms of how I think we can do that on campus. But yeah, not quite seen it working as well as I think we'd all like in an online space.
Great, thanks, Nasser. Anna, just to bring the kind of the student perspective on what this looks like on the ground, how did the shift to online teaching due to COVID-19 impact your learning experience as a student?
I definitely agree with kind of what Nasser's just mentioned about kind of the lack of social connectedness from having learning online. I know I struggled a lot with connecting with my course mates and building intellectual relationships with my professors, and really feeling the passion for my subject, just because I wasn't really in a situation where I could meet with everyone and have these discussions and really enrich myself for, to the degree that I did choose to study. So I know for me personally, the online studying, it wasn't very engaging. It really cut back on a lot of the motivation that I had to learn. And yeah, I think given now 3 years later, where everything's kind of calmed down a bit more, I'm back to more in-person teaching, I'm able to see how stark the difference was. So for example, now I feel a lot more confident in the subject that I'm doing. I realized this was the right thing for me. I'm engaging a lot more with the content and finding it a lot more interesting. But even though, the content remained the same, it was just the difference in environment that didn't really help bring out the most of it.
And do you think or do you have suggestions for what universities should do to try and help students who might be struggling with that online provision? Kind of practical advice or thoughts on that topic?
I think, first of all, recognizing the fact that we were all in a very precarious situation, and the in-person teaching style can't just very easily be translated to an online learning one. I think having some sort of provision with kind of maybe a drop-in support center, or just having more frequent contact with students on a more kind of one-on-one sort of interaction. I know we're supposed to have kind of personal tutors that are supposed to help us engage and keep track of our progress. But I found that during COVID that should have been highlighted a lot more. I think it would have been very great. I would have been very grateful for someone to kind of check in on me and my progress. So I think, yeah, just having that kind of direct link with someone would have been quite helpful.
Great, thank you, Anna. Liz, do Anna's reflections chime with your experience and your view of the impact that online teaching and learning may have had on attainment and progression and engagement on course at your institution?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting in the literature is there's a lot of literature on kind of what works in online learning, but the majority of it, of course, is amongst those students who've chosen online learning, and this situation was very different. And also, it's not just the students choosing online learning, but the academic staff as well. So, you know, we were all kind of last minute kind of bunging it together. So it's not necessarily that online learning is disadvantageous. What I think we need to do is evaluate like what works well and what needs to be done to provide a good experience. It's not necessarily just that dichotomy of online learning versus face-to-face. It's actually, we need to understand the good and bad of both situations. If you think now the kind of cost of living crisis and things like that, students are really feeling the force of that. Actually, lots of them are choosing to stay home, probably because it saves them on the bus fare, the lunches, that kind of thing. So online learning can be like, you know, really, really beneficial in those circumstances. And I think a lot of students, even now, they're kind of voting with their feet and saying, well, this is a great online alternative, I'll do it. So it's not all bad. I think what we need to do is evaluate what really works well, what students engage with, take away the kind of lecturer's point of view that they want people in the room, and do we need people in the room, and do students feel they need to be in the room? What makes a good online experience? What makes it worth those students coming in? So we talk a lot about student voice, and we might have questionnaires to ask them what they want, and I know there's been some massive kind of sector-wide questionnaires and things like that, but actually what we're seeing is students, you know, you see all over Twitter academics posting pictures of empty lecture theatres. It's not necessarily that the students aren't engaging, they might be choosing to engage in a different way. We could interpret that as, well, thank you very much for providing me an alternative and allowing me to flexibly study when I want to study. So I think we need to really understand more about when it's needed to come in and what students really need and what students really want, and not. So this is why I see this report as very much a starting point. I think we're all on a kind of learning curve and we've all come a long way, but we do need to make sure in the new normal, if you like, that we provide an experience that benefits everyone equally.
So if I could come in on that, Eliza, please. So I agree with much of what Liz has said there. Then I think that's what I was referencing when I was talking. Actually, maybe it's more of our on-campus provision that needs to change. And I think as colleagues, most of us will probably have got used to working in a hybrid way, where now if we come on to campus or into the office, we don't want to just sit in Teams meetings. We want the experience to be different. And I think we've done that well, actually, as a staff body, because when you come in, the meetings are different. The ones that we sit in at home tend to be more information sharing or more appropriate for the context. So I think, yeah, we need to incentivize students more to come onto campus by making it more worthwhile and making the distinction between the two modes clear. And yeah, the benefits in terms of accessibility and the cost of living crisis at the minute are clear. And yeah, we are seeing students vote with their feet as well, I think, like many other universities.
So would you say empty lecture theatre is not always a bad thing, Nasa?
I think if you've got to the point where there's an empty lecture theatre, it's not necessarily that you're an unpopular lecturer. There's all that context which isn't factored into the point in terms of the cost of living, etc. But I would go to, well, what's the positioning of that lecture? Because if it's an empty lecture theatre because they're viewing it online, well, actually, is that a meaningfully different experience to what they would have had if they were there? If they were going to be there and just watch a presentation, and they're now doing that at home, I think that's bad, because the lecture should have been designed in a different way to draw them in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of differentiated provision, thinking more about the pros and cons of the different ways that we can be delivering content. Undoubtedly, there will be students though who do struggle, and we know that from our rapid review that disadvantaged students might have less access to study spaces and the right resources. So what should institutions be doing to level the playing field and make sure that actually when you do have a really great differentiated offering, everyone can benefit equally from that? Asa.
Sorry, could you repeat that question to me, Eliza?
So what can institutions be doing to make sure that the barriers that some disadvantaged students face in accessing the online provision are tackled? So how can we make sure that there are spaces for students to study and they have access to the right resources? We're tackling digital poverty, because those general questions about differentiating learning and offering blended options may work really well overall, but leave some students out in the cold. So what can we do to make sure that we're reaching everyone and addressing equality in that sense?
Yeah, and I know the report provided the context of particular backgrounds as well, perhaps being in sort of overcrowded homes or other sort of access needs. And I think that comes down to the fundamental purpose of the university. And I see sort of the conversation today be more sort of around curriculum design in a classroom, but those basic needs still fall within the responsibility of a university. And I know in the pandemic, depending on the scale of the issue, we provided laptops, dongles, etc. You would like to think, and I know this is idealistically speaking, that our finance provision for students does not require universities to step in to provide that. But we know, and going broader here, the strain on students is so much that many universities are providing free lunches, free dinners, free breakfast. I know we're doing that. So I think the basic access elements you're proposing, simplistically, we should be meeting them, not ignoring the financial strain on universities too.
Liz, do you have any views on that? So aside from the kind of curriculum and how we deliver content, those basic fundamental needs of access, how and should universities and colleges address those?
So I think there's been a lot of emphasis over the past few years on digital, and that's obviously really important to make sure people do have that access. But my view would be that disadvantage isn't just digital. It is the being able to get to the library, being able to come in and have a study space. I know at Aston our students have been asking for more and more on-campus study space, for example, and that's something we're looking to provide. Because we know that's important, and you know, there's a lot of talk about kind of creating a kind of sticky campus. We want people to want to come in, if that makes sense. So I think the study spaces are really important. Yeah, it's great if you can have a free lunch or a free breakfast while you're on campus. I don't think that's the be all and end all, but yeah, travel costs. But one of the things when we looked at our learning analytics data during COVID was actually the biggest difference we found was in library usage between the different groups, and possibly not what you'd expect. Actually, the disadvantaged in our own analysis, not what we're talking about today, the disadvantaged students actually became more like the non-disadvantaged, whereas before they were actually tending to watch more lectures online, and they were actually engaging better, if you like. They're engaging more often, and they were using the library more, and possibly because they couldn't afford to buy their own books, you know, to take home. And it's those differences. So we would say that disadvantage is not just the digital aspects, it can be the physical aspects, having study space, having those books, those kind of things. So I'd probably quite like to see a shift, not to get rid of the digital aspect, but an emphasis on other things as well. Talked before about the a lot of the previous research into online learning. Possibly some of it at least says that the learner-learner interaction, so peer-to-peer interaction, is not so important. But possibly it is for students who wanted to choose an on-campus experience. It probably is. I've had a final year project student this year looking at that, and some of her data suggests it is important for our students at least. So I think we kind of need to not assume anything, because this is a completely unique situation. We need to not assume, and we need to start again, see what people actually want, see what the issues actually are, rather than guessing what they are, and move forward with something suitable for everybody.
Yeah, really interesting. As you say, just a complete change in the demographic of people who are using online provision. So a lot of our existing evidence that we might draw on maybe doesn't map onto the questions we're asking now. So thinking about it holistically and mapping that landscape is really, really vital. Anna, you were nodding your head then when Liz and Nasa were talking about study spaces and those the practical things. Do you have thoughts on that?
It just reminded me of something, kind of bringing back to the kind of, cost of living crisis. And I know sometimes I don't want to pay that £3 bus fare every day to go get the bus to uni. So one really good thing I think my university does is we have study spaces in town. So we have kind of buildings that are affiliated with the uni. And if you don't feel like traveling all the way up to campus, which is kind of across side of town, you can just kind of walk into town. It takes like 20 minutes. You go to this building. It's a good study space, very student friendly, and I know it's helped me a lot. It's helped my friends a lot. Kind of continue that kind of work-life balance, but not really put a strain on our finances at times. Also, even on our time, because when you go to campus, it's kind of like you have to stay there for the whole day to kind of get the most of your time out. But with kind of more local opportunities, you're able to kind of blend it within your day-to-day life, and that does kind of ease the whole process of kind of understanding that I am here to study, but I do have other things going on that I also need to kind of take care of and implement into my day-to-day. So I thought that was a really good point that Liz mentioned.
Yeah, fantastic. So such a practical thing to provide those remote spaces. I guess what we need to do is marry up the lessons about interaction and motivation and kind of engagement that we could build into those spaces as well to really maximize their impact. Okay, so thinking about the future, I think we've reflected on that there's such a massive change. This is such a huge shift that there's going to be some changes to kind of how we do things, the questions we're asking, and to evaluation as well. Anna, what are your thoughts about how this move will change the future of online learning? So in the next few years and perhaps in the next decade?
So I think there are very important lessons to be learned from this. I think another thing that Liz mentioned was kind of the learner-learner interactions. That needs to, me personally, I think if we are shifting more to kind of online virtual learning and having that as a backup in case, in-person needs can't be met, that same emphasis needs to be maintained. So maybe having more kind of sending out people into little groups like during the online session, or really engaging some debates, and perhaps smaller class sizes as well online, because I know there's a tendency to kind of just be chucked into a Zoom call with 200 people with kind of no cameras being put on, no one really engaging, and kind of feeling like you're just talking to a void. So I think just changing the style of teaching would be helpful, just because it probably, the situation is very much different from in person. So just having that understanding that a few changes need to be made to kind of reach the same effectiveness.
Thanks, Anna. Nasa, you're nodding your head. Do you see that in the future for higher education as we adapt to the challenges that this poses to us?
Yeah, and I think there's some broader questions too, for I think in-campus position, because I know we're talking about online, but I'm sort of flitting between online and blended, which I think most universities are adopting. I think if you are to be purely an in-campus position or in person, I think that actually might provide some sort of marketing or positionality to students, which universities might actually take advantage of. I think I recall, I might be wrong here, but it was the University of Bolton, and this was quite early, but they were, I think, in the second year of the pandemic, promising a return to all in-campus provision, and it actually became a point of distinction for universities. So I think that could return. And it has questions, coming back to what Anna was saying earlier, I think, it has questions around how we deliver transition and induction, because I think we all know, and Aston have done a lot of work around that first term, but in an online and blended blended especially experience, it becomes even more important, I think. And I know we're doing a lot around extended induction. As Anna was speaking earlier about the university checking in, it reminded me of the University of Greenwich Students' Union and the University of Greenwich. They've partnered around sort of a direct calling campaign from students to students, and that's something we're exploring too. And I think some more of that direct communications from individuals, supplemented, I think, with the data to direct some of that support, and that's of course likely to be provided through learner analytics.
Yeah, it's on the tip of my tongue that the link here to learner analytics is so strong, isn't it? Liz, I wonder if you have thoughts on both the role that technology can play in supporting that induction piece and then general support through HE, but also the broader piece around HE evolving to support online and blended learning.
Yeah, I think as Nasa said, I think the kind of early weeks are really critical. We tend to think of students as highly digitally literate, but we shouldn't assume that they know how to access all the types of software we're throwing at them in the first few weeks, because if we can't get that engagement, they're really going to struggle, and we're really going to struggle. I mean, I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater here, because some aspects of online have been really appreciated by students. There's evidence from students with disabilities, particularly mobility wise, that this is been great for them, because I think the sector's been saying for years, oh no, we couldn't possibly do that, and then a few weeks into 2020 and here we are doing it. The other thing I think a lot of students have appreciated, obviously different universities do these different ways, but we've had the ability to ask questions in the chat like we're doing today on this webinar, and students have been able to do that anonymously, and that's been great to give the students the confidence to say, would you mind like going over that again, or I don't quite understand this. But yeah, learner analytics, potentially really important. I think it's probably true to say that the majority of universities probably weren't measuring the right things during the pandemic, because that wasn't what the learner analytics systems were set up for. But yeah, they could be really useful in terms of identifying students who are not engaging as you might expect, or have low engagement, or suddenly stop engaging, or maybe they haven't even worked out how to log on to the VLE yet, or something like that. So I think we can put all these things together, and we don't necessarily only have to ask students what they want and what they think. We can use these kinds of data to I guess inform how we deliver and how well we're doing without asking, because we should be able to measure if people aren't engaging with it, if lots and lots of people aren't engaging with something, these people are paying for their degree. We can assume there's possibly a fair proportion of them that don't know where to find it, or don't even know it's there, or I think we have to take some of that responsibility on when there's not just assuming the students are not bothering, or they're too lazy, or they're not engaging. They might be trying to, but they don't know how, or they don't even know what they're supposed to be doing. And I think that there's probably a piece around certainly things like first in family students there, not having the support to say, well, you do know you're meant to be reading around your lectures as well, or you do know that's not the only work you're supposed to be doing, or just different ways of engaging. So yeah, I think there's a lot to do, and a lot to learn potentially.
There's so much there, such a rich area, and the question of what things you should be measuring, what things we are measuring, and how we get that full picture, definitely still to be determined. It strikes me that the idea of this hidden curriculum, so the way of being an HE and the way of getting the most out of it, may be even more hidden if you're not on campus as much, because there's none of that osmosis or just generally picking things up from people around you. So we need to be more explicit about that, and that is an equality issue as well.
I mean, some of our learner analytics data suggested that actually digital wasn't such an issue for our students. They were quite happy, but they definitely preferred the kind of live lectures than the just recordings. There's probably something about motivation there as much as digital disadvantage. Yes, it's interesting. There's a wealth of data that's probably stored across the sector in various formats that we could really learn a lot from, I think.
Well, I suppose that is another question for both you and NASA, is we know that we're not the only ones looking at data. Of course, institutions are doing their own analysis, but this is very rarely published. And when it is published, often it's case studies, and that's difficult to kind of extrapolate or learn from and grow this body of evidence. So what can we do to improve that situation
And
at NASA?
yeah, I can come in first. I think Liz will have more to add here, but we're now into an established area of work, which wasn't quite the case when I think this study was initiated, and there was so much to distract us. So I think it's now sort of thinking slightly broader than some of the equality issues like you've mentioned, some of the advantages, they're unquestionable around accessibility, but also how you describe the osmosis element of being on campus, I thought was really apt, Eliza. So I TASO do this anyway, but the way in which you partner with institutions, I wouldn't be looking at this as perhaps now a review of something that happened. We know it's here long term. So what do we anticipate are our longer term questions that we're going to be asking? So the chat GPT collection, I can't believe it's taken us this long. How does assessment look online, if that's something that we recognise as an issue? But I'm gonna hand to Liz, because I think this is more her bag.
Yeah, sorry, my Wi-Fi dropped out temporarily there. So in terms of publication, so I think people do try to publish. It's slow. We've had a paper in since summer, still under review. But I guess the other thing is people tend, written about this in another context recently in a Frontiers article about people tend not to want to publicise negative results that might reflect badly potentially on the universities themselves. So people are much happier to tell you about the good stories than the bad stories, but I think the bad stories are really important. So in not just in kind of this arena, but I think in the whole access and participation plenary, you know, what we've been advocating for is probably more of an open science approach where you can actually register the evaluation that you're doing, and perhaps publish on a kind of repository somewhere, or preprints and things like that, because the publication timeline is sadly slow and it's time consuming, and not everyone who's doing this kind of evaluation has the time or resources to try and publish in academic journals with the multiple levels of peer review and things like that. Sorry, am I still on?
You are. We can hear you, Liz, don't worry.
I'm having Zoom issues, I think. So yeah, I think I guess one thing a sector, someone like TASO could do is provide some of that infrastructure necessary for something like that. That would be something great if TASO were willing to take that on. But yeah, I think some kind of open science approach, non-judgmental, I think we'll get a lot faster, a lot further, a lot faster if we are transparent about what we're doing with kind of no judgments, if you like.
Fantastic, thank you, Liz. And your video is back, just so you know, we can see you and hear you. But we did hear everything you said, so don't worry. And just to echo that, you know, TASO, we subscribe to open science principles. We pre-register, we publish as much of our analysis as we can. We want to inspire other people to pick up pieces and do similar work. So yeah, definitely an interesting message for us. Others also want to be doing that on a similar thread. And we are a What Works Centre, but we really care about what doesn't work. We don't expect everything to work. If you look at other established What Works Centres, a very small proportion of things they test are found to be effective, because we're not all magic. We don't know what works straight away. This is all a journey to find out the most effective approaches. So absolutely, we should stand by and share results on things that don't work, and expect those results to be received in the spirit of sharing and learning together as a sector. We've come to the end of our panel discussion. So in the spirit of moving us on in good time, I'm now going to open the floor to Q&A. And I have some good questions in the Q&A chats, which I'm going to pose to the panel. I will just respond very briefly to Joe, who had a question about the analysis, which I'm afraid I missed at the top of the piece, which was asking about the provider which was involved in the analysis. They've been anonymised for the purpose of this analysis, Joe. They kindly shared the data, but we've done that in an anonymised form because this is really a blueprint, and we didn't feel it was appropriate to share the specifics of that provider. And in terms of repeating the analysis with more data from the period, that's to be confirmed. So we'll be looking at our programme of work for the coming year and talking to our theme working group about that and about onward steps. So if you're the Joe, I think, then you may be involved in that too. Okay, so I'm going to move on to some Q&A from our participants. So this is from Pete, and it says, unless with a well-resourced digital infrastructure, can you call it online learning? During lockdown was panic learning, and now we're in hybrid learning. So the digital divide, space and resource of lecturers and accessibility considerations, plus university culture. What are your thoughts on that? Is it really online learning?
I can try this one. Yeah, I would agree to some extent. Like I said at the beginning, I don't think students chose this, and I don't think staff chose this. I think staff have come a long way in the main at getting better at providing good quality online learning. I think that's the difference we're looking at. I guess some people provided potentially only recorded lectures. Some people provided interactive lectures. Some people provided opportunities to have breakout rooms and discussions. I think the quality varies a lot, probably across, not just across the sector, but even across the same university. So I think some of it, yeah, you could call it online learning. Some of it was probably just panic provision. So yeah, I think there's a lot to learn, but there's a lot that has been learned, and I think some of the technology available is actually really incredible, and we can, you know, it does have advantages. I know in sort of my area, health simulation and simulation of laboratory practices and things like that. We can have VR. You know, you can do this really, really well. Some of our lecturers sent home kits for neuroscience experiments at home. All sorts of great practice, actually, but probably a lack of consistency.
Nasa, does that chime with your experience? Is it really online learning?
Yeah, I would echo with what Liz says. I think we are into online learning mode because there has been a lot of investment. I think the digital infrastructure is there-ish. Like I said, we've got issues for particular students, but in the main, I think the fundamentals we have there in terms of the systems and structure. So we're now looking potentially at the people development piece, and we have gone a long way. It's that cliche of flying a plane as you're building it. And I think we are still flying and we're still building. Probably not quite as high an altitude, so there's probably less risk now because we have the in-campus division too. But yeah, I'd echo what Liz says there.
Interesting. I have another linked question from Ruth Sutton. So she says, has there been any research as to what digital skills people are bringing in from school and college? My teenagers no longer have paper textbooks and use Teams and OneNote in every lesson and to submit homework. So, you know, we're not unique in HE in this move to online or blended, or whatever we want to call it. And are there useful skills people are bringing through the pipeline? Anna, I wonder if you have any views on this. Do you feel like there are useful digital skills being developed before HE that people are bringing into that setting?
I'm not sure myself from my own experience, just because I think I was caught right in between the two kind of, I just finished high school, like college, when COVID was really big, and then started all online at uni. But looking from my younger siblings, for example, I know they're kind of, even in primary school now, it's a lot more technology focused. You know, the key skills of kind of how to use a laptop, do you know how to type? Do you know how to access kind of like a Google Doc, a Word doc? I think that's starting to become of much more importance from a much younger age. And that definitely will probably have an impact on kind of throughout your kind of years of studies. You know, developing those skills from an early age I think it will be very useful, because I think if from my experience of kind of not having that and then suddenly being very reliant on it, that was a very big jump to kind of get accustomed to. But I think having it kind of step by step throughout, to me, that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, less of a jarring transition when you've got a lot of other stuff to also get new on your plate. Nasa, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say on that point, I think it might have been Liz that mentioned this earlier in terms of digital skills and capability, but we have a huge population of mature students, and as part of my own induction to the university, I went along to a lively induction for the course, and from some of the questions I could really observe that there was a lack of digital literacy, and we are tempted to do more around that, but it would be here's how you find a journal and this is how you download it, but the questions would be, well, actually, where does that go then? So then it's in the downloads folder or whatever else you've chosen to save it. So there's some quite fundamental skills required depending on the profile of your university, and it probably extends to staff. So in a similar vein, I know when I joined the university, I had a colleague who had a career break to look after her young daughter and had left just before the pandemic and come back not too long ago. So she was just getting used to being in Teams meetings and switching things on again, because it's all unfamiliar. So I think it's just being aware that not all universities have a student profile that is just progressing from school or college.
Absolutely. And as someone who's recently returned from maternity leave, even a short period away from Zoom can really disrupt your understanding of how to use it. So, and the impact of belonging and confidence in a new education setting can't be underestimated. Thanks, Nasa. Liz, do you have any views on this digital skills piece and how we see continuity through from previous journeys, not just
like the others, I'm not aware of any explicit research, but yeah, it's just important not to assume that people know how to use things. I mean, I remember it was probably about this time 3 years ago, I asked for help for someone to set up a Teams meeting for me because I didn't know how to do it. I've probably done thousands since then. So I think it's about not assuming people know what's possible, and having, as Nasa said earlier on, that transition support to make sure everyone knows what's available and what we can do. So I mean, some people will have gone through kind of some students probably the whole of the pandemic doing their courses on their mobile phones, might not even have a laptop. And there are sort of technological ways of supporting that. So you know, some universities have invested in kind of VDI type virtual desktop infrastructure, so you can get really complex and expensive software just from something as simple as a mobile phone. Sorry, I'm going off the question now, but yeah, kids are more digitally literate than ever. Some of them are better. You know, if you want your phone fixing, you know, find your 10-year-old and they will do that for you.
Thanks, Liz. I have a question that's come through specifically for you, Anna, and it's from Maxine. And then they say, regarding the student perspective, what sorts of in-person teaching activities do you feel have the most value? So what would make you or your peers most keen or excited to actually come in and attend an event on campus?
I think any sort of kind of debates or tutorial groups, for example, because I'm very much lecture based, where it's kind of 300 people in a room, you sit there, they go through a PowerPoint, that's it, you leave. But the small kind of chances that I've had where I've had kind of smaller learning groups, I've found it a lot more easier to engage with the content, not only because there's more room for discussion, but just people like to talk, and you know, sometimes you forget that everyone has chosen the same kind of degree for a reason. There's a passion underlying this. So if you just put like 4 people together who are really nerdy about one subject, so much intellectual kind of debates will come about, and it's really enriching to kind of not only develop those kind of interpersonal interactions with these people, but to feel yourself very academically stimulated and really feel like I am here for a reason. And I think that feeling has been very helpful in kind of making me want to kind of get out of bed and be like, oh, today I have this debate that I'm really excited about. I would really like to go, and therefore I will give that £3 to the bus to get me to uni to enjoy that. Yeah.
Money well spent to go and nerd out with a group of like-minded people. Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Anna. So I have another question here from Megan Argo. I think this is a question more for Vanessa and Liz. It's phrased as a question, I think, probably for us on the report, but I'm going to rephrase it slightly. So they asked, did you find evidence that universities talk to academic staff with existing experience of online and distance learning teaching methods to help the rest of the other staff develop their skills during the pandemic? Many institutions have some experience of doing this, and that expertise and experience could perhaps be better harnessed to help develop other staff to provide more of that online or hybrid provision. We didn't do that as part of this work. We don't have an institution, we're not in an institution ourselves, and that wasn't kind of within the scope of the work we did. But Liz and then Nasa, I wonder if you have experience of that happening in your institutions.
Yeah, so we were fortunate in that our education team provided some training to all staff. It was actually mandatory training before we made the pivot online. So they looked at kind of the research in the area and what made a good experience. And we talked about things like how long a lecture should be, how long can someone hold their concentration in a chunk, how to make lectures live and collaborative, things like that. So yeah, we certainly have some training. I don't know how that pans out across the sector, but that's something we did.
Yeah, and I was at the University of Manchester at the start of the pandemic, and so I can't comment for you, Klein, although at the University of Manchester there's quite a well-established University of Manchester worldwide provision, and my recollection is, yes, they were involved in a similar way to what Liz has just described. And I expect most universities did that to varying degrees, and it will have perhaps been through that avenue or through whether it's an Institute for Teaching and Learning or the Centre for Collaborative Learning or Teaching Excellence, that are often names banded for the group of sort of internal experts looking at teaching practice. And I assume most sectors most universities lent into that group in their own university.
Absolutely, it's going to be vital to harness that, isn't it? And perhaps we need to see more to help facilitate that cross institutions as well, and sharing where perhaps there's more developed practice in certain areas. I have a question here on which I think is linked to some of the stuff we've already talked about, but specific kind of delves into issues around disabled students. So Pete comments that structural literacy development needed for students to use online products can be helped for them to access this sort of support. But some of the developments that were made during the pandemic, for example, to support disabled students, have been retracted in many universities. Are there any examples of universities that have maintained developments or enhanced them? So I guess when we put in place active support during the context of COVID-19, do you have examples of where that has been maintained or wrapped up, or what should we be doing in that space to harness those shocks to the system that were perhaps really helpful? Liz?
Yeah, I don't have any specific examples. I'm not aware of anything being sort of added or taken away at my institution, at least.
Oh, we've lost Liz.
Yeah, if I come in whilst we wait for Liz to unfreeze. I was similar position. I'm not sure of anything that's been taken away. I know recorded lectures, which is quite commonplace now, and other universities have them. That sometimes they can be contentious for staff who do not want to be recorded, and then the associated intellectual property. But I can't think of many things that have been rolled back. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So perhaps we just need to keep an eye on that and think about saving the best treasures that cropped up during that time and really identifying where there is value in that sort of provision. It does also have overlap, Pete, with some of our work we've recently published on what works for supporting disabled students and the idea of inclusive education and providing curricula and course design that works for everything is something that comes through really strongly there, but isn't that well evidenced. And I do wonder if what's happened during the pandemic has actually address some of that. It'll be really interesting to pick that up as the research literature moves on. But because there's a bit of a lag, I think perhaps we're not seeing the answers to those questions just yet. We have one more question in our Q&A, which I'll take. If anyone has any further questions, please do pop them in. Otherwise, I'll take Chair's prerogative to ask one or two before the end. So this is from Alexandra Kubica. Apologies if I've got your surname slightly wrong there, Alexandra. But they ask, are you planning to do any follow-up qualitative research interviewing students? It sounds like it would have been one of the ways to expand the understanding of how in-person versus online teaching and learning works. And particularly for disadvantaged students. So no, we don't have planned follow-up just now. We are in the process of devising our onward research programme based on this piece of work. So watch this space for more information. But we do have a live project and evaluating learner analytics programmes with 2 providers. And as part of that piece of work, we are doing some qualitative work on understanding their experience of learner analytics, which is a linked kind of use of technology in a more online way. So that will be really interesting and I think support our understanding on that front. So as I say, watch this space, and this is definitely an area of growth for us. So we'll be looking to create a richer picture. I have one more question, which I'll ask of the panel, and then I think we can probably wrap up a little bit early unless someone jumps in with a hugely contentious piece, which is, Anna, we're really grateful to have you here today as a student. But my final question for all of the panel is, how should universities and colleges use student voice and student feedback to inform how they respond to online and blended and produce online and blended provision? So Anna, would you like to go first? How do you think universities should be using student voice?
Well, I think, first of all, just understanding that we can provide so much insight from kind of being at the foreground of everything and really feeling it kind of firsthand. Again, kind of using that insight to develop some sort of structure around what it is that we would find beneficial, kind of this, if we kind of give an evaluation of this is what we found to be good, this is what we found not to be slightly good, I think that would be helpful to kind of implement some kind of structure around, for example, the way a course is taught or the assessment styles. And moving on from that, that would also, I think, improve the kind of student engagement aspect of it, because you're feeling heard, and then you're seeing the university really take it on. And then therefore that would, I think personally, for me, that would motivate me even more to really engage with the content that I'm learning, the university kind of identity, and, you know, feeling like I'm an academic and I am really here to learn. On the flip side to that though, like I know my university does a lot of kind of course module kind of evaluations. So there is a tendency for students to kind of not give that feedback necessarily. So it depends. You can't be over reliant on it, because at times it does kind of fall through. But yeah, I think the same way we've had this panel where I've just been one voice alongside a lot of other people's opinions, voices, just having that sort of space to have that open interaction, I think would be a good first start.
Love that broader impact on engagement and motivation and identity is just such an important piece. Thank you, Anna. NASA, how should universities and colleges be using the student voice to inform this work?
Well, one of my suggestions was going to be using not course evaluation surveys, or I think that's the phrase you used, but sort of more responsive and immediate feedback through whichever platform universities use, and make quicker changes when that are possible. And because I find the infrastructure around student voice has often been those archaic structures around student reps and school reps, and it takes quite a while for perhaps quite a small change to happen, when actually if the change could be communicated directly and be monitored at programme or whatever level it was, that could be implemented by a course leader or lecturer relatively quickly. So just to come back to Anna, so what was it, not to put you on the spot, about the evaluations? I think you used the term course evaluation survey, that you felt like you weren't putting, your students perhaps weren't completing them or not putting as much in there as they might want to.
Yeah, so it was kind of at the end of every module, the lecturer will kind of send a online questionnaire and being kind of evaluating it. Did you like module? What changes do you think we could implement, sort of thing? But I've personally never seen anything kind of come out of it. I think it's used more for kind of the feedback's used more for the lecturer themselves to kind of understand how they're using the course, how their students are finding the course and stuff. But what you mentioned about kind of the archetypes of the academic reps, student reps sort of thing, we have that every year. We have kind of the vote to be an academic rep, take part, but I've been an academic rep myself. I've, attended a lot of these kind of meetings, hearing students kind of come up, but it's like you said, the change never really comes at the time. And I'm not there to see it being implemented and actually put forward. I think I very much agree, kind of having that sort of immediacy would be helpful.
And I think I think it might be a platform of you colleagues are familiar with, but Uni 2, not a pitch here for them, but I think that's what that platform looks to do. So it's not at the end of a module or a course, but it's at any point and it's assigned to a program. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there. But just generally, of course, students should be shaping their program and what they're studying and their broader experience at the university. So of course, we should be listening to them proactively. So it doesn't end in a Twitter storm, of course. I mean, it's hardly facetious there, but in all seriousness, of course, it should be considered at the outset, so we can ensure it's really embedded.
Great, thank you, Nessa. So more timely and proactive use of student voice. Liz, any additional thoughts on that?
Yes, I'd say student voice is one important factor, but I'd say there are probably important to remember as well that there are student voices. So there's multiple, and particularly if we're looking at things like disadvantage, it's not always the right groups, if you like. You don't always tap everyone when you do a questionnaire. So I think that's important to remember. Sometimes it's the least engaged that you want to know why they're not engaged, and they're not necessarily the ones that are coming forward to give their voice. So I think you probably need to use other methods as well. Talked before about various bits of data that you can use that doesn't require the student to actually do anything. So I think that might be important too. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you, Liz. Well, I'm going to draw our Q&A to a close, so all our panelists can relax now. And just to say a really big thank you to all of you for joining us today. I found it a really stimulating session, and it's definitely helped me work through some of the findings in our report and think in a bit more detail about the story behind them, which I think is really important and probably one of our key onward steps on this topic. As I said at the top of the session, this is very much a starting piece, a foundation for more work on this topic. We think it's really important, so watch this space for more next steps from us. But as a key piece, we do think there's just such potential to do more data analysis using similar methods that we've used. So I hope some of you who perhaps in that sort of role might go away today and do a similar piece of work or in your own context, and be happy to share that with other colleagues so we can learn. Final thanks also to Dr. Rob Summers, who presented to you today, for all of his work on this, and also Rain Sherlock, our evaluation manager, who spearheaded a lot of the early work on this and on the evidence review. So big thanks to them for all of their hard work. Final reminder, please fill out your evaluation form, just like the module feedback forms. We really need that feedback, and we do listen to it and we do iterate. So look out for the email, and we want to hear from the disengaged group. So if you're annoyed or upset, we still want to hear from you. So please do fill in the emails. We hopefully will see you again at a future TASO event. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and see you all then. Goodbye.